Now that we've finished our unit on solving equations, we're going to move into another unit. This time we're going to be looking at fractions. And I know everyone loves fractions, which is why you're really going to love this unit, because this year we're going to teach you how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide with fractions on your calculator. So if you have not purchased a scientific calculator at this point, then you really need to get one tonight. Today is the last day where your assignment is not going to require the use of a scientific calculator, and you're really going to be a lot slower, and it's going to be a lot harder if you don't have one starting tomorrow. So make sure and remind your parents tonight to get you a scientific calculator. Now, today though, before getting into using a calculator to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, the first thing we need to talk about is estimating with fractions. Because the one pitfall to using a calculator is that a lot of times students become so dependent on the calculator that whatever answer it spits out, they're going to put as the correct answer regardless of whether it makes sense or not. So one thing that I want us to go over before we really get into working problems in the calculator with fractions is just how to look at a fraction question, and without taking a long time to work it out, just have a general idea of around what we would expect our answer to be, so that way we know whether or not our answer makes sense. Okay, because it's so easy in a calculator to punch one number in wrong, or accidentally punch one number twice, or leave one out, or hit the division symbol instead of multiplication, or something silly. And if you do that and your answer is way off and you haven't got any ability to estimate, then you're not going to catch the mistake. So today we're going to look at how to estimate with fractions, and it's a pretty simple concept. And the first thing we're going to look at is if we are adding, subtracting, or multiplying. Now, and when I say estimating with fractions, this also includes mixed numbers. So we're going to look at adding, subtracting, and multiplying, because they all are done pretty much the same way. Now really, to add, subtract, and multiply, really, it basically amounts to being able to round with fractions. Because in order to estimate, essentially all we're going to do is take the fractional number, say 3 2/7 plus 5 1/4, and we're going to round them to whole numbers before doing the addition or subtraction or multiplication. So, fairly simple concept. Essentially, rounding with fractions is just like rounding with decimals. With a decimal, anything that is 0.5 would round up. Anything less than that rounds down. Well, the same thing's true with a fraction. But 0.5 as a fraction is 1/2. So basically what we're looking at is this fraction greater than a half or less than a half? And really all that amounts to is the top number more than half of the bottom number? For instance, half of 7 is 3.5. Well, 2 is less than that. So 2/7 is less than half, because it's less than half of 7. So this will round down, meaning this is going to round to just 3. 5 1/4. Well, if I look at the 1/4, obviously 1 is less than half of 4, so this is 1/4 is less than a half, so it'll also round down, so we have 5, so we end up with 3 plus 5, so 3 2/7 plus 5 1/4 would be somewhere around 8. Now, obviously that's not our actual answer, but that gives us at least an expected answer, what we expect it to really be, so we can check our work. Now, as it happens, if we put this into a calculator, the actual answer for this problem would be 8 15/28, which makes our estimate 8 a pretty good estimate. And then that will allow for us to catch some mistakes if we accidentally added something crazy like 3 and 22/7 plus 5 and 1/4, and we get a much bigger answer, then it'll help us catch those kind of mistakes. So obviously the process for multiplying and subtracting are much the same. Say for instance that I have 14 and 7/9 minus 3 and 1/7. So if I wanted to estimate this, I would look at 7/9. 7 is more than half of 9. So since 7/9 is more than a half, instead of leaving it 14, I'm going to round that to be 15. And then if I look at 1/7, well, 1/7, obviously 1 is less than half of 7. So that's less than a half. So I'm going to just round that one to 3. So then I get 15 minus 3, which gives me 12. So my estimated answer for this one is going to be 12. Now, once again, the actual answer for this is a little bit off from that, but not by much. This comes out to be 12 and 40/63. So, once again, pretty close to our estimate. Now, if we look at multiplying, we're going to have a little bit more variation. Let's say that I have a multiplication problem. Let's say, for instance, I have 12 and 2/5 times 7 and 6/11. Now, my first step again is going to be to estimate so that I have numbers that I can work with more easily. So, looking at that, 2/5, 2 is less than half of 5. Half of 5 would be 2.5. So that's a little less than half. So I'm going to round this down to just 12. And then if I look at 6/11, half of 11 would be 5.5. So 6 is a little more than half. So I'm going to round that up to 8. So now I have 12 times 8, which gives me 96 as my estimated answer. So I would hope that my answer for the actual number will be something in that ballpark of 96. Now, the actual answer for this one comes a little bit further off. It is 93 and 31/55. Now, with multiplication, we expect our answers to be a little bit further away, because if you round a little bit, but then you multiply it by a large number, that small little bit of rounding gets multiplied to where it makes a bigger difference. But still, we can see that it is pretty close in that ballpark. It's only a couple away. And when you consider the size of the number, 93 versus 96 is a very small change. So, once again, we can kind of just double check and make sure, if our calculator spits out an answer to this that's like 9 and something, and we know our estimated answer was 96, then that just gives us a little bit of guarantee that, okay, hey, I must have messed up something in my calculator, and I can go back and type it in again and make sure I do it right. Now, the last thing, and the one that's a little bit tricky sometimes, is dividing. How to estimate with dividing with fractions. So, let's look at an example. So let's say I have something like 17 and 2/9, and I'm going to divide it by 4 and 3/5. So we can start this the same way as we started addition, subtraction, and multiplication, which is by just rounding. 2/9 is less than half, so this would be something around 17. 3/5 is more than half, so I'm going to round that up to 5. But now we have an issue in that 17 is not divisible by 5. And remember, the main thing you need to keep in mind here is estimating is supposed to be making the problem easier. It's getting an idea of what you expect. It doesn't have to be exact. So if you round your numbers to get a division problem, and then your division problem is still working with yucky numbers, then I can always round them a little bit more. So what we can do is we can do what we call compatible numbers. 17 isn't divisible by 5, but what number can you think of that's close to 17 that is divisible by 5? Well, there's a couple of choices there. You might think of 15, which is only a couple numbers smaller. And if we did 15 divided by 5, that would give us 3. But then 17 is also pretty close to 20, only 3 away from 20, which is also divisible by 5, which would give us 4. So really, I would expect my answer to be somewhere between 3 and 4. But here's the thing. If I ask you which estimate is correct, 15 divided by 5 or 20 divided by 5, it doesn't matter. The whole point is that it's an estimate, which means it doesn't have to be exact. So while there are some estimates that are better than others, really, ultimately, as long as you're getting somewhere in the general range and helping yourself have some common sense about your answers, then really any estimate's better than no estimate. So let's look at the actual answer to this one. So if I punch 17 and 2/9 divided by 4 and 3/5 into my calculator, the actual real answer that I get for this is 3 and 154 207ths, which is in between 3 and 4, slightly closer to 4 than it is to 3, since 154 is more than half of 207. So a little closer to 4, but really, if you got 3 as an estimate, or if you got 4 as an estimate, then you should feel pretty good about the answer 3 and 154 207ths that you get in the calculator, because your estimates are pretty close. Now, there's one last thing that we want to talk about, which is instead of mixed numbers, if we have fractions, there are two really important concepts you need to understand, which is, first of all, if I take something and I multiply it by a fraction, my number is going to get smaller. This really messes with our heads because we're used to multiplication always making something bigger. But the fact of the matter is, if you're multiplying by a fraction, you're actually making the number smaller. The reverse of that is also true. If I take a number and I divide it by a fraction, not a mixed number, but a true, proper fraction, something that is less than 1, if I divide a number by a fraction, then my answer is going to get bigger. Again, messes with our heads because we're used to the concept of dividing by something, making it smaller. But the fact of the matter is, if I'm dividing something by a half, that means I'm asking how many halves will fit into it. Well, if it's 16 whole numbers, then you can fit 2 halves into each whole number. Then you're going to have more halves than there are whole numbers. Whereas if I take a whole number and I multiply it by a fourth, that means I'm taking 1/4 of it. So I'm breaking it into fourths and only keeping 1/4 of it, which would make the number get smaller. So one thing you do need to watch out for with your calculator is if you ever do a division by a true fraction, expect your answer to be larger. If you ever do a multiplication by a true fraction, proper fraction, then you should expect your number to be smaller. So that basically concludes what we'll be doing on just some estimating with fractions. So I have a worksheet for you all to complete in class. Whatever you don't complete in class will be homework on just practicing with estimating with fractions. And of course, you can always ask Miss Stuckey for help if you're having any trouble with